All right, good morning, everybody. I would like to begin with gratitude by we are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. If you are joining from Zoom and can hear me, you may be joining from traditional lands of other peoples in Canada or around the world. And we would like to collectively acknowledge the owners and caretakers of these lands as well. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Fiona Beaty back to UBC. Fiona is a settler living on the Sunshine Coast in the Squamish Nation's territory, where she works in service of community and Indigenous-led marine stewardship along the coastline of British Columbia. Her current role is the science coordinator of the Great Bear Sea MPA Network Initiative. She's also a National Geographic explorer. She advises a myriad of nonprofit marine conservation initiatives in the Salish Sea and holds a doctorate from UBC, where she had the misfortune of working under my supervision. But that means that I'm required to tell at least one anecdote, which is I was always impressed with Fiona for a number of reasons, but her dedication to stepping aside from the traditional, well, this is what a marine ecology lab is supposed to do, and think about what big questions she thinks are important and that she's passionate about, and then pursuing those questions. So thank you for bringing a wealth of new insights to me, and we look forward to hearing from you today. Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thanks everybody for inviting me to speak with you today to share some of what I've learned through my work since leaving UBC 2.5 years ago. I want to start with an expression of gratitude to the Indigenous communities and nations who I have had the honor of working with and learning from over the last decade, particularly the Squamish whose territory I grew up within, Squamish Nation, and currently reside within. I'm extremely grateful for the way that they've shaped me, and you'll hear echoes of that impact and those learnings throughout my talk today as I share stories about marine planning and marine stewardship from along the BC coast, and a little bit about transformation. So this is going to be largely a storytelling presentation. There's only one data graph, and instead you're going to see a lot of pictures, some pretty art, and hear stories that I find inspiring and guiding compasses for the way that I do my work. I also want to recognize that almost all of my lived experience and work is based in British Columbia, and I know that there's tons of you who work and live elsewhere in the world, so I would love to hear about how some of these stories resonate with you and how you think that they could be applied to other contexts. So as Chris mentioned, I am a little bit of a dreamer, and I like to have lofty goals with my work. So I kind of want to bring that into the room today. This is the final sentence from my dissertation, where I stated, overall, I hope that my dissertation, but we can replace that now with work, encourages other researchers to expand their work across disciplines and audiences, and advances academia's ability to serve societal needs and generate meaningful impacts that protect the life around us. So that's our goal today. We're going to dream big. And we're going to try to aspire for those bigger picture impacts. But to ground us, we're going to learn about these stories of marine planning and conservation in BC. So at its most basic, marine planning is the process of visioning and decision-making associated with how humans relate to the ocean. It involves gathering together information about our relationships, our uses, our behaviors, and our values associated with the sea, and then figuring out what our course is for how to achieve those visions. And often there's a spatial component where you put information onto maps and you understand how to balance different uses like transportation or development or fishing or conservation or cultural access, and ensure that there is as much compatibility and as little conflict as possible. And one of the really great outcomes of marine planning processes is the identification of places that are important to protect and the reasons for protecting them, which can be very, very varied. This image is taken from Kitasoo Bay, which is a bay further up British Columbia's coastline in the Kitasoo territory. And in 2022, it was designated as an Indigenous protected and conserved area by the Kitasoo First Nation. And one of the reasons for protecting this bay is illustrated on the slide here, where you can see nation members who are harvesting herring spawn that's been deposited on tree boughs. And Kitasube provides 95% of the nation's herring eggs that they harvest as a part of their culture and way of relating with the ocean. So it was really important to the nation to protect this bay, and they decided to protect it through applying Indigenous legal tools and inherent management practices and rights to the region. And so this is a really beautiful illustration of how culture and ecology drove the creation of a protected area under Indigenous law. This slide is kind of zooming out to an international understanding of marine protected areas. So the definition on this slide there comes from the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And they define MPAs as a clearly defined geographical space, recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to advance the conservation of nature. So it's very like jargony and a little bit of a dull definition there. But the emphasis, as you can see on this slide, is really the protection of ecological features in order to provide benefits that span social, cultural, economic, and ecological outcomes. And I do really want to focus on how this messaging is really ecosystem oriented, but we're going to talk about how there's a need for a more balanced recognition of the reasons for designating MPAs and the values that they can contribute. Globally, around 9.6%, well, actually 9.6% of the global ocean is protected within a MPA. This map is showing us the distribution of those protected areas. But what's really important to recognize is that not all MPAs confer the same benefits because they come with a varied array of objectives and also human activities that they can manage and restrict in there. So we have fully protected MPAs that tend to be the protected areas that deliver the most durable and high impact outcomes. And then there's highly protected, lightly protected, and minimally protected, which kind of allow for more mixed use, more human access, and tend to not provide as quick or as high impact ecological and cultural outcomes. So MPAs are primarily established to address spatial human activities, such as where we fish or where we're building or where we're kind of being out there on the water. But another motivation for creating MPAs is to help to alleviate the pressures facing ecosystems in order to bolster their resilience to climate change. So a couple of weeks ago, I hosted a knowledge sharing seminar around the theme of the interaction of MPAs and climate change. And it was a really wonderful opportunity to learn from people who have been involved in MPA networks throughout the world and also along the BC coast. And one of the takeaways for me was the fact that MPAs are not silver bullets to climate change. Surprise, surprise, climate change is very complicated. But they can, in fact, provide ecological resilience by protecting harvested species. And through that protection, you can avoid trophic cascades that will lead to severe ecological impact as we experience heat waves and other effects of climate change. So that was a result that came out of California's MPA network process, where for decades they've been monitoring spiny lobsters and sheephead and other harvested species, and they found that those species and those ecosystems within protected areas were more resilient to the 2014 to 2016 heat wave along that coast. But elsewhere, climate change effects are so strong that they can dominate the affected protected areas. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but there is evidence for that bolsters resilience, which is really nice. Another thing to emphasize, as I alluded to earlier, is marine protected areas are really not just about conservation. And I think this is a really important message for us to understand and champion and talk about increasingly. MPAs are incredible avenues for also advancing food security, for supporting governance and sovereignty, for securing economic stability, increasing income, supporting cultural practices, and improving people's connection to place. So these are those outcomes that I was talking about, those really critical cultural and social and economic outcomes. A study in 2023 found that coastal communities that are located closer to fully protected or highly protected MPAs had increased incomes and increased food security, partially as a result of that protection. So there's those co-benefits for people, and it's super important that we talk about these when we're discussing MPAs so that people understand that full suite of outcomes that can come from establishing them. In Canada, we have a number of different legal tools to designate protected areas under Indigenous and Crown legal systems. So this circle graph or circle figure on the right is showing us several different tools such as Oceans Act MPAs and National Marine Wildlife Areas. Each of these tools is intended to protect certain features and address or manage certain human activities depending on the legal system that they're associated with. And that really calls forward the fact that no one protected area is going to solve all of our issues. And it's really nice when you can advance initiatives that apply a mosaic of tools to generate kind of like a portfolio effect of stewardship and conservation. And I want to draw your attention towards the word network in the circle of the center of that circle. It's used to talk about that like mosaic of different tools, but the way that I'm going to use it is slightly different for the rest of this presentation when I talk about networks of protected areas. So generally, when we have a single protected area, if it's well managed and enforced, that's great. It can deliver positive outcomes for people in the ocean, but those outcomes can be enhanced if that protected area is nested within a broader connected network of protected areas. So at this point, I'm going to take us on a little tour. We're going to leave UBC's campus and go further up the coast toward the Northern Shelf bioregion, or otherwise known as the Great Bear Sea. So this is a very large region. It spans 2/3 of the coastline of British Columbia, so over 100,000 square kilometers, and there's over 100,000 people who live within the area. It spans from the Kwakwaka'wakw People's Territories in North Vancouver Island up to Tsimshian and Haida Territories on the north coast, so pretty large. And this region is oceanographically significant on a global scale in terms of the upwelling and the productivity of these waters that feeds incredible planktonic life and kelp forests. And that, of course, feeds an abundance of life that allows us to support, or allows this region to support, some of the largest organisms in the world, like blue whales and fin whales. It also has the highest coverage of canopy kelp in the world, so a really important temperate region to protect. And humans are a part of this incredibly precious place too. First Nations in this region have lived in relationship with the land and the water for over 13,000 years. So their cultures are deeply interwoven with this place, and their cultural survival and stewardship visions really drive the Great Bear Sea MPA network process. And yet this region, like so much of the world's ocean, has experienced a lot of pressures over the last few decades. So overfishing, climate change, pollution, shipping and transportation, all of those are impacting the health and the abundance of ecosystems here and the dependent communities in the region. And those pressures led 17 First Nations to partner with the provincial and federal governments to collaboratively advance this network of protected areas in the Great Bear Sea. This is the first network or MPA network in Canada to be implemented, and it's the first Indigenous-led MPA network in the world. So it's a very important large-scale marine conservation and stewardship initiative here. Is there a way I can get rid of those?
Might be able to do it. Keep talking.
Oh, wait, I think, yeah. Sorry for the pause. There we go. Now you have a clean slide. Okay. So this map is showing us the distribution of protected areas within the Great Bear Sea MPA network. And I just wanted to emphasize a few things about the process. First of all, the 17 First Nations, provincial and federal governments collaboratively designed the whole process and are collaboratively implementing it. And that implementation is guided by legally binding collaborative governance agreements that articulate how Crown and Indigenous governments are working together to co-implement, establish, and manage these protected areas. These are very important documents, and they're kind of internationally noteworthy for how they are illustrating the cooperation and the collaboration across these levels of governments. 50% of the network is existing protected areas. So it's not a whole bunch of new protected areas. When the planners were looking at where to protect, they really started with what already exists, that backbone of protected areas that exists along BC's coast. And then they built or identified new protected areas based on top of that. The vision is that 20 to 50% of the network will be fully protected. And that's intended to achieve and to align with like international standards on protection, but also to respect the fact that in a lot of these places, it's not feasible to exclude all activities. And there's very good reasons to allow for certain activities in specific areas. The network will have a mosaic of different designation tools. So here you can see on our left some of the designation tools that are being applied throughout the region. In addition to those, there are Indigenous protected and conserved areas that are being established. And throughout the design process, there was a really strong emphasis on protecting both ecological and cultural conservation priorities. And those cultural conservation priorities were identified through a rigorous planning process led by the partner First Nations. Finally, this network is designed to achieve representation, replication, and connectivity targets and design guidelines. So it's being designed and planned and implemented to function as a cohesive network to generate that portfolio conservation effect, and where possible to allow for connectivity between the MPAs. This timeline is drawing recognition to the fact that these large-scale marine stewardship initiatives are very long. They take a lot of perseverance and commitment by the governments and the stakeholders and communities involved. So this process has emerged from decades of work, starting in the early 2000s with First Nations in the region leading their own marine planning processes and identifying their marine stewardship visions. And then in the 2010s, they partnered with the provincial government through the Marine Planning Partnership to kind of harmonize sub-regional plans and figure out alignment with those marine stewardship visions in partnership with the province. In the mid-2010s, the federal governments came to the table as a partner and a network planning process commenced. And then for the last 10 years, the governance partners have been working through iterative engagement with stakeholders to gather feedback on the design, the potential locations of protected areas, and really to minimize the negative effects and maximize the positive benefits to communities and folks in the region. In 2023, the Network Action Plan was published, which articulates that layout map that I showed on the previous slide. And sets us on a roadmap for how to implement new protected areas. And then last year, the collaborative governance agreements were signed, along with this big scale long-term funding agreement that secures $335 million to support this initiative for the next 20 years. So all of those milestones take so much work. It's not an overnight process, but the fact that it's spanned decades really does build resilience and persistence into this initiative to hopefully make it strong despite political waves of uncertainty and all sorts of different challenges that face this region. And now we're in the implementation and site establishment phase. Since 2023, 4 new sites have been already established, and there's a timeline for establishing a whole bunch of new protected areas. So it's really exciting. I'm stoked to be a part of this. I've been working in this position for about 2.5 years now, and I'm still learning so many different ways that during the planning process, there was a ton of thought and intentionality into making this a well thought through network. One of the tools that was created is something called the Conservation Gaps Analysis tool. And what this does is it makes sure that estimates of the representation of ecological conservation priorities account for potential negative impacts with human activities to make sure that we're being realistic about what the network is actually protecting. So for example, if you're trying to protect 40% of the eelgrass in the region within protected areas, and you have a protected area where there's an overlap with a human activity that could negatively affect eelgrass, such as log storage and handling, this tool will decrease the contribution of that protected area towards the eelgrass representation target. And in doing that, it's just being more realistic about what we're protecting and factoring in the idea that many of the zones and the sites within the network are not fully protected. There is human activities that are allowed. And so we want to account and quantify that as we establish new sites. This is the data graph that we're showing. So we can see that the results that tool tells us, as I just mentioned, the alignment between the representation of features in the network. So I encourage you to just focus on the blue graphs. And you can see that the light blue is showing when you're not accounting for human activity, and then the dark blue is the scaled down representation of that feature based on the negative interactions with human activities. And you can see for some species like sponge reefs, it doesn't really matter when we account for the human activities because we are still far above the upper representation target that we had for that species. Whereas for other species like yellowtail rockfish, when you account for negative interactions with human activities, now the representation falls below our upper target. And so that might indicate that we would want to maybe add new places where that species is protected or address the human activities in existing and proposed protected areas to bolster the protection of that species. So I've spoken a lot about the design process. Now we're going to shift to what I've really been focusing on over the last few years, which is the development of a network monitoring program. Monitoring is essential to understanding to what extent the network is achieving its goals and objectives, to what extent it's functioning as a network, and to what extent the monitoring information is informing decision-making and adaptive management. And so to create the network monitoring program, we've been working through it in a three-step process of creating a framework, strategy, and plan, and also just drawing lessons learned from marine protected area monitoring programs and MPA network monitoring programs throughout the world. And I'm just going to show this is a conceptual figure from a hot off the press paper that I was involved in, led by Natalie Ban, that kind of talks about some of the ways to approach social ecological monitoring of protected areas. So we know that MPAs, as I've mentioned, are designed to create good ecological outcomes like more fish and bigger fish. So monitoring programs often exclusively focus on measuring those attributes, which obviously doesn't tell you the full picture of what's going on. MPAs can also confer social outcomes, human well-being outcomes, and this, like in an ideal world, we're leading to positive ecological and social outcomes. But we also know that improperly designed MPAs can lead to marginalization of communities and negative effects. So we want to make sure that we're trying to track those impacts to humans to build towards the positive outcomes. But this has been an under-monitored thing elsewhere in the world. Importantly, though, those outcomes are moderated through human behavior. So we won't see positive outcomes if the human behavior is not aligning with what the MPA is trying to do. So for example, if people don't know that there's a protected area, if they weren't involved in the planning and design, they might not comply with the restrictions or with the management measures associated with that protected area, and then you won't see the ecological and social outcomes you're trying to generate. There's a whole host of reasons why or a whole host of things that will affect the human behavior. Including needs that people have, knowledge they have, attitudes, values, norms, all these things. And those are affected often by the MPA design process, in addition to the governance and management. So this is all kind of drawing this picture that in addition to measuring fish, we also really need to be focusing on people. And that's where social science comes into the picture very strongly. That was a huge lesson learned from California's network monitoring program, from Oregon, from elsewhere in the world. To emphasize that monitoring needs to be spanning the suite of human, ecological, and environmental indicators. And so that's some of what we articulate in our monitoring framework, which was published last year and is available on our website if you want to check it out. There's a lot more information there on like some of the best practices we're employing in our monitoring program. But beyond that, like kind of more technical lens, I also want to share a lesson learned that I've experienced over the last couple years, both in grad school and through this position, is the reminder that how we do our research, whether it's monitoring or lab work or field work, is critically important and an opportunity to practice care and reciprocity in order to bring about those bigger picture impacts that we're trying to generate. And one of the resources that I read during grad school, Pollution is Colonialism, came from a scholar on the East Coast, Max Liboron, whose lab studies ecotoxicology. And they have some really beautiful protocols for how they deal with organisms in the lab and dissect them. For example, not listening to music, so you're actually connecting with the organism who's giving their life for your science. And repatriating organisms to return them to where you collected, rather than treating them as biohazardous waste. And I think these little revisions to how we approach our science actually can can confer a big impact on the ways that we move through the world and can increase the respect and care and stewardship that we can practice with the ocean. So just a reminder to bring that care and that lens of respect and reciprocity into our research processes. Okay, so I'm going to zoom us back down the coast now to the Salish Sea and talk a little bit about the marine planning and stewardship that's happening in this region. The Salish Sea is very different from the Great Bear Sea. It's a sixth of the geographic size, the water here, so it's 18,000 square kilometers compared to over 100,000 square kilometers. But it has millions of people. There's multiple large urban centers like Vancouver, Seattle, and Victoria. And so that means that like that smaller spatial scope and the many, many more people here means the pressures and the intensity of those pressures looks different than further up the BC coast. There's also 65 Indigenous communities whose territories span this region, and it spans an international border. So all of those factors complicate how we live in relationship with the water here and how we take care of it. This is also where I grew up. It's my home waters. So I spent a lot of my childhood scrambling along the rocky shorelines of the Salish Sea and playing with kelp and crabs and stuff. And I think that was a good reason why I was drawn towards working in Chris's lab to study how marine invertebrates respond to climate change here. It's my home and it's the body of water that I care deeply about protecting. Some of my dissertation research kind of contributed to this story and the realization that the Salish Sea, and particularly the Strait of Georgia, is a hotspot for climate change. So Lighthouse Station sea surface temperature data from along BC's coast has indicated that the Strait of Georgia is warming at double the global average rate of warming. And then this figure is showing us that when you look at sea surface temperatures along the west coast of North America, you can see that a lot of the west coast in the States is pretty cold, driven by the upwelling there. But there's this consistent, during the summer, like a green hot patch in the Strait of Georgia, which is indicating that for species whose distribution spans the whole coast, like the snail on this slide, Nucella lamellosa, the warmest part of their species range may be in the middle as opposed to on the southern edge. And that complicates the narrative for us predicting how the species will respond to climate change, because in the middle, there's not going to be that same northern latitudinal shift as oceans warm. And the species here are probably living toward the warmer edge of their physiological tolerance to warming, which could increase the risk of extirpation here. And this story is potentially true for other inland seas in the world. So just one of the ways that climate change is affecting the Salish Sea, in addition to all of the other pressures. Another chapter in my dissertation looked at working in partnership with the Squamish Nation and community groups to create maps about people's relationships to the ocean in this fjord at Katsamhow Sound, which is very close to Vancouver. I'm sure many of you have driven along it as you go up to Squamish and Whistler. And this beautiful map was created by Chief Ian Campbell from the Squamish Nation, and it illustrates knowledge and legends and practices and guidance for associated with the Squamish Nation's culture. And I think it's a beautiful illustration of how to convey knowledge in a map in a creative and artistic way. These are some of the maps that I created through my research, so a lot less awesome and artistic, but still at least taking us one step further to visualizing how humans relate to and value the ocean. And these data can be overlaid with species distributions and human activities as one of those foundational data sets to inform marine planning. So because of the complexity of this region, it could be that marine planning is easier to conduct at these smaller spatial scales of a watershed, and then we can harmonize them through the region, hopefully to bring about that bigger marine planning process. But this research was really wonderful to contribute toward. We conducted interviews and surveys with community members who live in the region to ask them to share with us how they relate to the ocean. And a critical way that we sort of changed the process of conducting that work was to involve youth from the Squamish Nation. So they were the ones who were asking their community members the questions in order to contribute towards that intergenerational knowledge exchange that's super important in engaging people in marine stewardship planning and planning processes. Another really wonderful example of marine stewardship that I'm inspired by at Cutzam Howe Sound is herring surveys that have been led by a nonprofit in the region called the Cutzam Howe Sound Marine Stewardship Initiative in partnership with the Squamish Nation. They've been doing this work for about 5 years, and each year the surveys adapt and morph and expand to include community ceremony, education. There's now a Squamish youth snorkel crew that goes out, and this year they conducted a smokehouse. They built a smokehouse to process herring and give that food out to their community. And this is so inspiring to me because herring largely disappeared from at Cutzam Howe Sound for about 40 years due to a whole host of pressures in the region. And it's really wonderful to be a part of this resurgence of energy and sharing of science and culture and connection to place. And one of the outcomes of this project is a storybook that tells the story of herring swimming through the sound in both Squamish language, and in English. And this project was actually funded through UBC's Community University Engagement Support Fund. So I wanted to give that plug. I actually just looked, and the deadline was September 25th for this year. But for students who are hoping to do community-based work, that's an opportunity to secure funding to allocate towards your community partner to help support them in coming to the table to do work in partnership with you, and to create cool education outcomes like books. Okay, so we've talked about a few different case studies or examples of marine planning and stewardship in British Columbia. And so I wanted to kind of switch gears for the last portion of my talk to discuss ways that we can transform our research systems to continue to grow the meaningful impact that we can have on the world around us and on communities who we work with in order to enhance marine stewardship outcomes. A couple of years ago, I was involved in a really awesome leadership cohort that generated this paper that provides kind of like a three-stream process for ways that researchers, particularly natural scientists, can enhance the meaningful impact of our work on communities. And the main avenue for doing that is by building deeper relationships to place. So the three avenues that we discussed, or the pathways in the paper, are individual, collective, and systemic. And that's kind of recognizing that there's all sorts of scales that we can contribute toward transformation, depending on people's capacities or entry points or interests. And not everybody has to do all of the work. We're working in a network. So it can be, I know, overwhelming, especially as students, when you're like, I want to make all of these big changes happen, but I have limited timelines and resources, and I don't really know what to do. So starting just with yourself and learning a little bit more about the contexts where you work can be a really beautiful way to start. Learning about social science practices during my grad school was really transformative because I wasn't really exposed to research ethics much. And then through some of my participatory work with communities who I mentioned, I learned about this whole world of research practices and ethics that can help reduce harm. And natural scientists aren't always exposed to that work. So I think that that's a really great area for us to lean into a little bit more. The second avenue is collective. So work in partnership with other people, collaborate with historical ecologists to understand what these ecosystems looked like in the past, or archaeologists, community partners. All of that can really transform the impact and like the holistic understanding that we have of places where we work. And then the systemic pathway is largely targeting the funding and the training systems associated with academia that in some ways put up barriers for researchers to deepen their relationships to place, particularly for early career folks who are incentivized to live here and then live there, and you're uprooting yourself all over the place. And that can be harder to develop those longer term relationships with your communities. So in the paper, we articulate a few like targeted systemic pathways to enable people to cultivate roots. And as I mentioned, I just want to emphasize with any like change making and activism dialogue, there's a spectrum of engagement and there's a spectrum of ways that you can participate in this work, and not everybody needs to do everything at once. So finding the path that feels right for you is really important toward the end of grad school, I was introduced to this like Venn diagram questions tool that I've sort of continued to populate over the years. That is a helpful way of figuring out what your role can be in change making. So answering these questions is a part of that. The top left circle talks about kind of like the context where you're working. What is it? What is the work that needs doing? What is the solution that you want to advance? The top right circle talks about you as an individual. What can you offer to this problem? What are the skill sets and resources and networks and magic that you carry? And then the bottom circle is talking about what fills your needs, what brings you joy, and what energizes you, because that's super important in this work. You need to make sure that the way that you're working is healthy and sustainable, and you're receiving value from the work. That might be making sure that the work-life balance is met, that you're making enough money to support your needs, all of those sorts of things. And through answering those questions, you can hopefully build towards finding out what your role can be. So this is helpful for me. Another tool that I've been exposed to more recently is the butterfly of transformative social change. And these roles were penned by Leah Penniman, who is a farmer and food sovereignty activist in the States. And I really like it because it's kind of drawing recognition to the fact that we all have different ways of showing up in change-making spaces. So the winglets are resist, reform, build, and heal. And for many of us, we might have sort of like a mosaic of some of these, but feel more drawn towards one and definitely not drawn towards the other. But the recognition is that like collectively, we span these winglets and all four of them are needed to bring about big picture change. So I like thinking about where I gravitate, and I thought that this could be a nice tool for others to think about it. The final resource that I want to share or reference is I'm a part of a network of hope for the Salish Sea. And this is a really wonderful group of environmental leaders, researchers, conservation practitioners throughout the Salish Sea who are committed to talking about and amplifying messages of work people are involved with and solutions people are trying to advance and examples of inspiring change that's occurring all around us. Part of the motivation for this is the fact that our news systems and our media and a lot of our just rhetoric is biased towards problems and towards issues, and that can be really overwhelming. And we actually have a choice and to counter that in many instances and to notice when we're kind of going down those rabbit holes, and then to maybe just like look up a little bit and see that the work people are doing around us is happening and we're not alone. There's this like starting line fallacy that sometimes enters into our mind where like all of the work is ahead. But really we are all like a part of doing a lot of work, and there's tons of organizations and leaders around us who we can learn from and just listen to a little bit more. And there's a book that a friend of mine has just put out called How to Be Hopeful. It's not intended to be like delusional hope. Her whole philosophy is evidence-based hope. So it's looking at, as I said, the examples of work that people are doing and being accountable to tracking that work and communicating out to people so that we are aware of things that people are working on. And in the book, she has kind of like 5 stances for how to practice evidence-based hope, which I really like. So that draws my lecture to a close, or the seminar. I hope that the examples of marine planning and stewardship that I've shared are inspiring to you. And I hope that some of these tools can be helpful guides as you navigate your own work and journeys, whether you're students or professors or community members, whoever is joining. I'm sure that there's like some small negative guidance that this can contribute to your work arenas. So I want to thank everybody who's been involved in my work. Thank Chris and Iowa for inviting me to share this work. And of course, thank the ocean.
Are there any questions for Fiona?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I was interested in the scaling of the MPAs by anthropogenic effects, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the sort of healing that has happened over the centuries, you know, as logging has changed, salmon canneries have disappeared and so on. Are you able to factor that in into your thoughts?
Yeah, so the question is asking how the like varied level of intensity of human activities is factored into the identification of protected areas? Yeah, so in a lot of instances, protected areas are identified to be located in places that have been severely impacted by human activities in an effort to like halt the decline. And those tend to be the places where we do see, if that MPA is well enforced, we do see quite significant changes before and after implementation, and that can contribute towards evidence that MPAs are working. In the case of the Northern Shelf bioregion or the Great Bear Sea, there are many instances where MPAs are located in places that have been hit hard, particularly by fishing. But there were also instances where the partners wanted to protect places that haven't been hit as hard in order to maintain and preserve those healthy sites. And that is also a really wonderful thing to do. It's kind of more like that forward visioning of like, this is healthier than other places. Maybe it's not what it was 100 years ago, but it's still in relatively good condition, and we want to keep it that way. And when we monitor those sites, we might not necessarily see the same magnitude of difference of effect before and after establishment. So that will be important to communicate so that people understand like these protected areas are still functioning in maintaining and preserving healthy ecosystems alongside the ones where we're seeing those, like, hopefully that recovery.
So I think a lot of people, when they hear MPAs, think about like exclusion from a place. And I'm wondering what opportunities you see for MPAs to maybe play a role that's more about like transforming people's relationships to places to be like non-destructive rather than like just excluding them from those places, but maybe maintaining those same relationships that are kind of the problem.
Mm-hmm. So the question is about ensuring that MPAs don't exclude people and allow for the opportunity for people to maintain and grow their connection to place and practice stewardship. I think that's a hugely important consideration, and definitely is front of mind for a lot of the people involved in the MPA network process, and a big thing for the South Coast too, because in a lot of instances it's near impossible to exclude people from regions here because there's just so many people already. So for First Nations, for example, many of the MPAs are not going to prohibit their constitutional rights to fish and to practice their culture. So they will still retain access and connection to those places, which is their inherent rights. And for community members, I think there's a lot of importance in working with coastal communities and stakeholders to involve them in the management of these protected areas, in the communication of their benefits. And in most instances, like, the protected areas are not going to be excluding everyone from that access. These are also very remote places in a lot of instances, so access is more specific than, say, on the South Coast. Here in Howe Sound, for example, at Cutsum, that's part of the reason why I shared that herring story project. That story of the herring surveys is that's not a protected area initiative, but it is a way that people are increasing their connection to place through more engaged research. And so I think that's the lesson, like striving for participatory processes, striving for engagement, and also recognizing that MPAs need to be established in partnership with education programming so that people continue to care about the ocean.
Thank you, Fiona, for a really interesting talk. I had a question about your maps, where you had like social, cultural, and ecological. I just wanted to make sure that I understand appropriately what you're representing there. So I'm assuming because of how they move inland, that it's like benefits from the ocean. But I was just, when you say high, medium, high, slowest, what is being measured, or what questions are you asking, and what are they reflecting?
Yeah, so these maps are visualizing places that people drew. It was a participatory mapping process where interview participants and survey participants drew on maps the places that are important and then talked about why they were important. And then we coded that information and overlaid it to identify the highest overlap. So the dark areas are where there was the most overlap, and then kind of like fading out to less. So I think what's interesting is looking at them, you can see like for certain values like cultural, there was a lot more place specificity than for other values like ecological, and these all have different sample sizes associated with them that I didn't include, but yeah, it can help identify hotspots or areas where there's maybe less conflict than otherwise anticipated. So you can see like the hotspots for ecological in the middle of the sound. overlap with a pretty low economic impact or economic value identified place, which could indicate a potentially good area for stewardship or conservation measures.
Okay, thank you.
There's a question online from Rashid. I think he's looking for the difference, if you could sort of briefly talk about the difference of social versus cultural and maybe also how economic fits into that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. First of all, like a lot of these values are interrelated, and that came up a lot when I was doing this research, is I'd ask people to identify places that were important for social values, and then they would talk about why they were important for all of the values. So I think that there's a level of categorization we try to do in research that's just inaccurate and doesn't quite fit with how we relate to the ocean. But within my process, I was building on different values typologies from participatory mapping. So examples of social values would be places that are important for supporting education and recreation and research, whereas cultural values might be places that are important for cultural practices and for more like spiritual ways of relating to the ocean. In the MPA network process, cultural values were explicitly referencing the First Nations cultural values because their cultural ways of relating to the ocean are distinct from how other coastal communities relate. And it was really important to center those values in the protection process.
So another question online.
Okay, maybe one final
One
question.
final one,
Yeah.
okay. So you're talking about the effect of climate change, and the question relates to how effective are MPAs and how do you make them effective in the view that species distributions might be changing due to climate change?
That's a great question. So the network, there was an analysis of how the sites within the network can provide climate refugia through time. And two things we know about how climate change is going to affect the ocean. Obviously, it's very complex, but deep sea regions are deoxygenating and the surface is warming up. So in some ways that leads to like a squeeze in the depth zone that certain species can occupy. And so the network was designed to span a whole bunch of different depth zones from shallow to deep. And so we're trying to really emphasize that message so that all of the sites are established so we can get that suite of effects. I also want to say, though, that MPAs are just one of many tools that we need to use to manage and to protect these species. Fisheries management is huge. It's often separated from the MPA conversation. Obviously, they need to come together so that we can like collectively protect these species because MPAs are place-based.